So this idea of a network society really came about in the 1990s, and it really came about with the idea of the internet. And what is really important about it is the fact that we are no longer just entities, or we can't just be thinking about ourselves as individual entities, but we are kind of it's about the self in relationship to others, and it's basically these lines of networks of relationships that starts to identify what kind of society we are starting to construct. And what is really interesting about Van Dijk's book is that he starts to talk about these 4 tiers in terms of the individuals, and they are networked and have relationship with groups and organizations and communities. Sorry, just admitting people again. And also the and then that together, these kind of communities and these organizations then start to form the larger forms of social systems and cultural systems and political systems and economic systems. And so the world of the commons really starts to be around this groups and organizations and the networks that they start to construct, and how those networks and those organizational relationships start to form a new form of social, political, and cultural and environmental systems and economic systems. And so in a way, that ecosystem of relationships again and again now has become more and more evident in also things like the map of the Wood Wide Web, and the fact that we're realizing that actually there are lots of relationships between nature that we may not have known about in the past, but they are also networked organisms. So we become part of a complex system of networks, be it with our differences, with our conviviality, support, care, conflict, and so on. And it is the focus on those relationships and the quality of those relationships that we need to start to refocus and rethink. And some of you might think, well, we've known that because the theories around relationships have been around for a very long time. But actually, the way we actually practice, the way we operate, and the way we do social organization still very much is focused on the individuals than it is on the kinds of relationships that we're starting to construct or wanting to construct. And I talk about that a little bit more later. So by that, if we start to think about less about the focus on individualism and ourselves as individuals, but more in terms of us in connection with others and our identities with others, then that's where the relational comes into it. Then I apologize if people know about this already, but it is something that if you are in the arts or in cultural field, you might not know about it as much. And it is really, really important in terms of what we produce and how we produce. So this process of socialization, which is in social sciences, is the process of learning behavior in a way that things become acceptable or become our realities. And these are so unconscious in a way, and so in the background, that sometimes we're not even aware when they are really happening. And so they form from the moment we are born in our families, from the language we speak, from the relationships we have, from values we hold, the rules we comply with, and so on, to our peer groups, to the religions we become part of, to the media and the built environment around us, to our ethnicities and the values within that, to our schools, which is where we get re-socialized, to clubs and social groups that we decide to join, to our work environment and the government through the laws and sanctions and messages that they put out there. And I think all of this constructs basically the environment. Sorry, I'm going to mute all because I think there are still some people. So that kind of creates this environment where we kind of start to construct what is real to us and what we think is the way to do things. And that's really important, because you have to then re-socialize if you have to retune those things. And that comes with a lot of reflective thinking and critical thinking, which I talk about later. Now, in terms of the COVID situation, we have had, sorry, I focus on Newham because I've been quite involved during this process with Newham Council as a resident and also as someone who works in the area, that there are lots and lots of things that basically popped up during COVID, from mutual aid groups to food banks to skill banks, and it has kind of left me thinking, I hope these things just continue when people are no longer on furloughs, or they kind of when things go back to normal, and what happens to all of that kind of social wealth that was generated through these kind of initiatives that were very positive and created. And so can we actually start to think about building sustainable social organizations that don't tear us in different directions from being a volunteer and being somebody who has to make a living. And I think that has been quite a big issue for me, as a, at one point looking at my timesheet and realizing that I'm spending like 40% of my time as a volunteer supporting different kind of initiatives, and actually that had detrimental personal kind of impacts and so on. So how do we bring these things together? And that's where the commons started to become really interesting, because they start to negotiate these different worlds. And I talk about that in a minute here. So the book by Kate Raworth, Donut Economics, that I highly recommend, even if you listen to it in Audible. This isn't exactly what she says, but this is inspired by a lot of the reading around commons literature, but also it's kind of, her book just unlocked it slightly, where she actually talks about common good and the commons as different to the binary between our private sector and public sector, and where we produce private good in the private sector dominated by the markets, and the public good open to all, managed and stewarded by the state and the public sector. And then what happens in this middle ground, where you start to have slightly precarious volunteering activists, kind of third sector, if you like, organizations that from, again, kind of looking at 60 different case studies and literature, they are quite precarious, and they also a lot of the time start to either borrow from the logic of the private sector in the way they organize themselves, in the way they govern, and in the way that they design their systems, and sometimes from the public sector. But actually what the commons start to introduce is that they actually are different, and they are generated, common good is generated from the ground up They are generated based on needs of specific communities. Those communities have very specific boundaries and specific communities. They are not the all public, the crowd that the public sector is looking at. They are much more, the commons are much more about contextual, specific, particular particularity than the maybe universalism of the markets or the crowd of the public. Now, what Kate says and what I absolutely believe is that we need an ecosystem between all of those things so that they are all important and they work together, rather than what we have today, which is a monoculture of capital and pricing embedded in the focus of the private. And once we have all of these working together as an ecosystem, then that's where we start to have those balances between the community, the public, the politics, the public, and the markets. And then that's where we start to see the creativity of the commons kind of really being able to take shape. The other aspect with the common good is that they are, you know, who produces them? What kind of systems do they get exchanged in? You know, so if you're in the market, then that's the market system that you exchange for money. But the common good still, it needs to be financially sustainable. But how do you design the systems within which common good is produced, used, and exchanged? And that's some of the things that we try to discuss in the context of the cultural commons. Now, just really briefly, this is really at a glance. The reason why I got attracted to the commons in particular was that they have a deep history, especially within the British context, you know, from Magna Carta to, you know, then the breaking of the commons through the enclosures, through further breaking of them, the tragedy of the commons by Hardin, who said that that people free ride and you can't have the commons because then the commons get destroyed. And then Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2008, who took on Hardin and the tragedy of the commons and said that, created very rigorous, obviously, research that it is not about the problem is not the commons. The problem is the way we govern and the rules of the governance of the commons. And since then, there's been quite a massive shift in looking at the commons from the perspective of their governance and how we govern them, and thus the reason why governance and organizational structures are quite big in commons thinking. Then Charlotte Hess started to talk about something called the new commons, which I talk about in a minute, which is not the natural commons like land and water, air, you know, and those natural resources, but more new, complex, man-made commons. And then there are obviously, because it's so deep in the theoretical thinking in terms of common good, it goes as far back as Aristotle. It is also embedded in our UK legal systems, from common hold law in terms of land ownership to common law, to commonwealth. Okay, it has colonial connotations, but anyway, House of Commons, common land, and then these other aspects which are very much commons-based thinking, but are not, they don't call themselves commons. They might not even want to call themselves commons. It doesn't really matter. But citizens' assembly, some of the ideas around localism and Localism Act in terms of bottom-up production of policies and neighborhood planning and right to own and right to build and so on, co-production, politics of difference, and decentralization, which goes back to our network idea that we were talking about earlier. So that kind of idea of decentralization, but governed with a systems-based governance structure that brings it together into a commons governance. Now, you might think, well, why would you go through all of that? And a lot of that, again, I will talk about why these organizations are really important, because what you need are on the ground, you need these face-to-face experience-based relationships. The problem at the moment is that the world of the universal world of policies and politics and the world of experience on the ground are not meeting. And they are, of course, we have in between organizations like the third sector and so on, who you would say are kind of trying to do that, but they're negotiating services to the community rather than it kind of operating from both sides and meeting in the middle, you know, where the power is distributed in both sides and kind of being coming together in a collaborative sense in the middle. So, and these are some of the obstacles, again, that again in the research so far have come out, and huge in community, in citizen engagement. And that's the power relations and decision making. That's really big, because wherever power is concentrated, that's where disempowerment to the other starts to happen. So these mappings of power relationships become really, really important within the commons before you even start to design the commons project or the commons organization. The power relations in community organizations themselves, and that has to become, again, really quite obvious, not to start adversarial relationships, but to start dialogue around how do you design where certain structure, you know, certain structures become more equalized and horizontal, and so they don't become, with some being in huge positions of power and some in huge positions of disempowerment. And then there is competition over resources and funds and volunteers and spaces, and a lot of that is really because the governance structures and terms of engagement and the systems are not put in place for those things to be clearly defined. So it's all left a little bit into kind of informal interpretation. So just giving you a very direct example, working in a community group where one community was infused with another just because they had put some planters, as simple as this, had put some planters in another person, in another territory that another group thought they had territorial rights over. They thought they were helping them. They thought they were encroaching over their territories. And because those had not been quite clearly set out in terms of relationships of what they're getting and what they're giving, and those kind of terms and conditions which Eleanor Ostrom talks about in governing the commons, then these kind of feuds and conflicts starts to happen, and it breaks the commons. It breaks the relationship within neighborhoods of these different community organizations collaborating and creating what is called the civic commons. lack of awareness that community organizing and democratic empowering management requires knowledge and skills. We are not born with the skill. This doesn't need, just like crafting anything, this also requires crafting. Not understanding how to develop empowering programs and projects, and thinking more about predominantly about giving service to and creating service provisions. And I know that there is a lot of work, and I've been involved in a lot of co-production of services, so I completely understand that. But again, even with co-production of services, some of those people, it's kind of who is involved, who has decided on the needs, and so on. And there is a lot of discussion around determining needs as well within the whole kind of commons thinking. So these are the new commons. This is completely emerging knowledge. So there is very little actually out there, which is what makes them also really exciting. So there's the cultural commons, which is what we've been talking about, neighborhood commons, infrastructure commons, knowledge commons, medical and health commons, digital commons, market commons, which I don't really understand at all, civic commons and global commons. Again, I don't understand. The grey ones I don't really understand that much about, so please don't ask me. But the orange ones are things I have quite a bit of knowledge about. So those are also very much, all those four are very much relevant within the urban context. That's the urban context is where we could embed a lot of these practices in neighborhoods and work together with public sector and housing associations and third sectors to look at the civic commons applications. So what do the commons produce? They produce common good, which are collaboratively developed from the bottom up, based on the needs not decided on by those from the top down, but the bottom up. I'm not saying that the top down cannot be, like top down public good cannot be determined, because it absolutely can be, but that's not the same as common good. And I think that the distinction between these two things are really, really important. The problem with the two of them being so kind of intertwined is why we don't actually articulate the logic of the commons and the common good properly. The methods of engagement to unearth common interests and needs. So common interest is very much part of the common good. And so when you talk about methods of engagement, which gets talked about quite a lot, especially in consultation, then I talk about them quite a lot through events and different scales of events, because I think that's much more interesting, both those of you who are interested in theory, theoretically, but also in terms of design. So designing events is both a spatial, cultural, and creative and social preoccupation. They can be collaborative, they can be from the ground up, and they can unearth common interest. I will talk about these in terms of a project, so you'll see that it's not all abstract. They produce social and political communities. So we have also lost our social and political communities quite a lot in this kind of drive to constantly grow, produce, and just to survive and earn a living. So how do we create new forms of organizations which are cultural, spatial, community-based and social, that actually start to create our political and social communities, as well as producing other things? And that's what I'm really interested in. And there's a talk on the 15th of April by Alice Holloway, one of our students, doing amazing. She's designed an incredible organization which does just that as a fashion designer. So organizational forms designed to enable plural, diverse voices, so platforms for listening. So again, you know, we talk about, especially now, we talk about diverse voices, we talk about politics of difference quite a lot, but actually the reality of it, when you are in a situation where you have a platform to have those discussions, and you might absolutely disagree with what somebody is telling you, and because it is so against your morals or values, or so unfamiliar to you that you will just reject it. And that takes a lot to just listen and not to shut off because of how you've been socialized to have certain values. And so in just talking about it like that, you know, seems quite simple. In practice, it is really hard. You know, what happens when you're sitting across as a liberal left-wing person across to an alt-right nationalist, you know? So that, you know, I know that's kind of quite extreme, but I think those are quite important to think about. Collaborative, empowering governance built into everyday life. So that's the thing. The commons are very much about everyday experience. They are not kind of, and that everyday experience, you know, some of you might say, yeah, but I work in an organization and that's my everyday experience. Absolutely. So how does one create those in the work environment as well? They create common spaces. Care ethics becomes really important within the commons, and that's another shift in thinking, because, and it was really, really critical for me for my PhD, because there was a lot of talk around ethics based on rights and individual rights. And again, it goes back to the entity, but ethics of care and relational ethics of care not only starts to talk about partiality and not just impartiality, but it also focuses on mutual responsibility within the relationship. So the relationship in there is what we have to care for between the different entities. And it's not my relationship to the person. It's not this me and this hierarchical relationship again. It's a horizontal one where everybody in that situation is responsible and has a duty of care to the relationships that are being set up. In that situation, that competitive, conflictual relationship or power relationships, all of those can be pulled out. And I think that's what's really, really interesting and exciting about that, because you start to talk about ethics based on the fair, not just the fairness, because that goes into the rights-based ethics, but in terms of the care that's needed. And I'm not saying that people should not have power, by the way. I think everybody needs to feel they have power. It's more where that power is misused, where that power is concentrated too much on particular individuals, and where that power is used to dominate and disempower others. And that's where the check needs to happen. And that needs to be designed as part of the organizational governance. And also really, another thing that is really, really important is the fact that the commons are like the guilds, let's say it like that. They have a boundary and they do have a set community. That community can decide to make their resources open to all as a public good, or they can come together to protect a public good. But the reason it is defined community, and it has a boundary, but the design of that boundary, of that community, what binds them together, how they allow others to enter it, because you don't want to be an enclosure, otherwise then that's another enclosure. You're a private entity then, and you are not a commons. You have to have the design of its boundary is really, really intricate, and it's really, really important. So ultimately, the commons are forms of carefully designed practices based on collective care. They produce common good, either at the micro scale or at the macro scale, which becomes, the macro scale is more, goes into systems design as well. Actually, systems design goes into both, but practice is embedded in concrete situations, like I talked about earlier, in tangible experience and engaging with everyday life. It's designed, it is designed and created from the ground up. And so, you know, we hear, and the reason why I am so interested in it is also you hear more and more the disenfranchised communities, those who feel neglected. You look at Trump America, you know, there's all of that, where there are communities that feel that their everyday life is just not compatible or not listened to in relation to what is happening in the market that has left them behind because they couldn't access it, or politics that is not really engaging with that such ingrained, fine, everyday kind of relationship. And when the commons, which are so important in the context I just talked about, become just volunteering and become just this slightly precarious context, then they cannot do what they're supposed to do in kind of bridging and dealing with this kind of bigger issue. What I also showed when we were talking about the socialization aspect is that all of this is mediated through our material world, be it art, be it architecture, be it design objects, be it whatever, it is our material world. So a lot of this is negotiated through artifacts and through objects. So again, that's where the role of the objects as something that has agency and as something that it becomes a political object in a way in this context, in the context of the commons. This is this wonderful diagram by Kate again and Donut Economics, where she really starts to make a position about the complexity of our economic structure, just not be just the rational man that our economic model is based on right now, and the monoculture within which it's been set up is just not fit for purpose. And we need to embrace complexity. We need to embrace relationships and networks. And so I think that becomes really interesting in terms of that the commons start to put into question our current economic model, which isn't just the commons. There is a massive kind of move towards kind of re-evaluating our economic structures anyway. And actually, if you look at, if those of you who might have heard about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and blockchain, this is happening already. And it's just a matter of time anyway for the decentralization of our finances to take hold. So the commons need social entrepreneurs, and if there are hardcore commons people here, they would shudder at me using the word entrepreneurs. But in a way, I do think there is a spirit within entrepreneurship that we do need to maybe claim back within these contexts. But because they are creative, and their forms as organizations and their outputs are really, really important, and they don't have to feed the market. And I know that's really hard to think about, but I think we have to go back to that diagram of the public, the private, and the commons all working together as an ecosystem. And it's not so that, you know, it starts to, you have multiple plural ways of generating income and generating and supporting the common good and the commons. And that again needs to be designed, that economy, or the business plan, if you like, of the commons organization needs to kind of look at that ecosystem. It can't be purist. None of them can be purist. They are carefully and rigorously designed to create a balanced ecosystem of what we produce and how we produce it. And that goes back to the criticality of, you know, what natural resources are we using in what we produce? How do we produce it? What's the form of production? What's the form of labor? What kind of systems are extractive or non-extractive that we're using? And where do they get exchanged? Where do we sell it? Who is it for? And so on and so forth. And I think that rigor, really digging deep into those things, is where the innovation actually comes out a lot of the time, from what we've seen with the students' work as well. So could we design the new common practices and organization to start operating post-COVID, embedded in our communities? So I think it's a call really for, do we use this opportunity as a way to rebuild? So rather than rebuilding more just to feed the hungry market, can we rebuild to build our common good? I love this thing about organizations having aesthetic. And if you think about, so I'm making beauty really, really, you know, it's a deep philosophical concept, but I'm making it really simple through just saying, you know, of course, something beautiful gives us joy and happiness, right? So if we say we're making beautiful organizations, everyone engaged in it and part of it and having some relationship to it will need to kind of find it beautiful, right? So this I'm not going to talk about this very much because this is Alice's project and she's going to talk about it. But I suppose what I think is really incredible about this is that she starts to talk about her fashion organization, the way that the social organization within it is working through different tiers of communities. And if you, rather than workers, they are different tiers of communities. And by actually framing the different people in the organization as communities, not just by word or rhetoric, but by the actual fact of them being part of a community, you start to introduce very different forms of programs or relationships, or the way you interact and how you create solidarity or autonomy in those and the ethics of care, than if you are again talking about this kind of entity-based individual, me have a responsibility to you, and it's a one-way power hierarchical relationship. And again, you know, that has public and private sector involvement in it. It has implications into the neighborhood where she's embedded in Brixton. And so if we start to look at organizations as crafted, beautiful products, where we nurture cultures of social relationships that are, you know, good for our mental health, for our empowerment, dealing with our inequalities and so on, then we don't have to have separate programs that starts to deal with mental health. A lot of the issues around mental health also comes from feeling disempowered, feeling you don't have control over your life, feeling you can't get ahead, you can't survive. So I think that it's a much more holistic way of starting to think about the way we start to design the organizations through which we produce things, be it services or products or things. Yeah. So I just a few slides now just to talk about this diagram. And I'm going to move basically from the middle, moving up, just talking about one specific project. I don't know if Rosie from the Roman Road Trust is here, but this is a project that is also a research project with London Met that started in 2014. And at the heart of it is the form of relationships that we've wanted to make throughout this project, be it them being collaborative and convivial as much as possible. So the first thing is the common good and artifact. One, we have the land owned by Clarion Housing Association, who are now wonderful partners with the project, but they were more maybe hands-off at this point, trying to kind of just test our partnership. But they gave us permission to build this classroom, which our students, my studio at the time, used our studio with Jane McAllister. And we had our classes, but also we started to have different products with fine art students in terms of posters, furniture with design students, paintings with fine art students, comic books with architecture students, and ceramics with fine art students. So there were lots of kind of collaborative products that came out of this based on dialogues and conversations. And that's not anything new really in terms of what participatory cultural practices do. But I suppose what might seem new is these different tiers until we get to the commons. So then we produced lots of initial events, asking people to run events. We ran events, and it was really to start to find common interest, to start to see what people were really interested in from the bottom up. And this was really tricky because the council, Tower Hamlets, kept saying, but what are you doing? Why are you doing all this? And we kept saying, look, we want to know from the ground up what the interest is. I'm not going to give you a program that I've designed because that's not the point. And it was quite we had to keep them back, and I had to be quite dogged about it. And they kept saying, I just have to put it in my form. But anyway, it was kind of quite interesting, that kind of relationship of trying to keep them at bay, to really get people to do this in order for us to understand that, and also start to meet the community. And who are they? Who wants to be involved? Who shares those values of wanting to run a space and having this as a common space? Then we met lots of new people, and the collaborations became deeper, and the events became more collaborative. So designing different events in collaboration, and that deepened the relationships because we were working together to deliver a project. So that's the next level. That's the next level of the relationship deepening. And meeting new people, part of their network, so it grows again. And so Women Work down here was a London Legacy Development Corporation, V&A, and Sadler's Wells Commission, which then we worked actually with women that we had met from the Common Room in Bow, but also from Stratford in other projects that we've been involved in, and bringing these kind of different groups together to co-produce this kind of event, and as a performance, but also as costumes, as props, and so on and so forth. So again, it went back and created these other objects. But again, you know, up to the orange, all of these are very much part of what will probably be, to a lot of you, familiar participatory cultural practice, or public art, or participatory architecture. But actually, the commons is the solidification of those relationships into a more sustainable form of organization, social organization, that is committed to offer common good going forward, you know, over a long period of time. So it's a formalization process. Up to this point, it's all quite temporary, quite experimental, and probably very familiar. But up to then, this is the point where the kind of formalization starts to happen. And that's actually where we are now making the permanent building in collaboration with the Roman Road Trust, where we did the Space Hive with GLA, Greater London Authority, where the mayor gave £50,000 towards it, and a partnership with Clarion Housing Association. Now going forward, it becomes really a civic commons as well as a cultural commons, where there's a partnership, a collaborative partnership between the Housing Association and the Roman Road Trust and the Common Room. And us as facilitators, we hand over that to the community. And I think that sounds very simple, but actually there is quite a lot of kind of processes and designing of ways of working together in making that happen going forward as well. And then, of course, it all has to have an economic model. And another scale of it, because people also say, oh, well, that's very well in terms of the organization, but what about scaling up? And I think scaling up is really interesting in terms of this. The community, we supported really initially, but the community have been running this neighborhood plan out part of the Localism Act in the same area where the Common Room is. And one of the areas is this resilient community of network and infrastructure in terms of a community development trust, potentially. Again, Neil, one of our students, has been doing that, not through, before he became a student actually, in Hackney Wick, and it would be really, we will be talking to him in terms of how that could happen if we manage to get the funding to do this. But again, that's where it scales up across the different community initiative, different community projects across this area. Why isn't this moving up? Yeah. I suppose two things, as you see, going across: this reflection at every stage, reflection in action as you're doing it, and on the action after you've done it, and the ethics of care based on that is really, really important. And sometimes they're not that linear, if you like. They just happen, you know, something works, somebody says something, somebody tells you, but you know, I have to get paid for this, and why do I have to be a volunteer? Then you start to think, ooh, labor. And so it is quite, it creates this very agile, dynamic process. And also there's a lot of learning that has to happen, and for me a lot of that happened through doing it as a research project, and you know, academically, also using theory as a way to reflect in that learning. This is something we hope to work on in the future. Actually, we're really keen on economy for common good as a partner, to see how we can start to develop that further. So if you're really intrigued by all this, then you can start to follow us on Instagram, Design for Cultural Commons, on Twitter and on Facebook, or subscribe to the to our mailing list, so you get the public talk programs and all the different public programs. So that's kind of one way of informally starting to learn about the Commons, and of course you can read the literature out there as well. But I think I also just want, in the last few slides, and sorry it's taking quite long, but the last few slides, I just want to talk about why all of that I've just shown you has resulted in the courses that has been set up at London Metropolitan University, and why I think they're really important. The courses actually, I think the other thing which is really interesting about them, they're not just courses. For me, they are one of those aesthetic organizations, commons organizations, and a political project in themselves, actually. And they are to really start to support this this development of these kind of forms of organization to produce the future common goods for our society. But the courses were really because of my observation and reflections in those communities, and in my teaching, realizing that forms of organizations, it was very difficult for people to translate a lot of those theories into actual organizations that would be ready to go. And even doing that, there's still, even if we do a 5-year plan, it still, you know, needs kind of mentoring and so on in order to really, really push it. Not that you can't do it without doing the courses, of course, but it just is, you know, like everything else, you can go through apprenticeship, right? Or you can go through university and do that through that. But so we started, we're doing PG certificates and PG diplomas as a way to do this training in terms of, you know, developing these kinds of projects and practices, and really rigorously mapping and developing them in real situations. And then we also have these partnerships with the Design Museum and the Tate Exchange Program at Tate Modern, which I'll just touch on in a minute. So they can either be through staff development, through your institutions and organizations. You can, we've been talking to Clarion about potentially putting community organizations through, or other advocates, advocating organizations who would like their members to go through this. So we're looking at fundraising to subsidize the positions and so on. Or they can also develop research proposals to feed into PhD and MPhil programs. Again, practice-based PhDs and MPhils, not purely theoretical. And just to kind of give you a map of that really quickly, so the modules on the PG certificate and the PG diploma, there's a history and theory one, which we rigorously look at the common good based on your disciplines, what you've produced in the past, what you're looking at, and what you're thinking of developing in the future. So really innovating in what are common goods, what are waste products at the moment, how do we transform them innovatively using design as an innovative tool. Commoning practice, literally how do we organize, you know, everything in terms of its governance, in terms of the boundaries I talked about, in terms of the ethics, in terms of the in terms of its economic models, website, you know, all of that, we kind of develop that through a commoning practice, and then a project of what that project would be. And these, yeah, we have partnerships with those two organizations in terms of the public program. And lastly, I think what is also really interesting, and we're going to start developing that in the summer together with our alumni past and present, students is a Commons Alumni Association, almost as a cultural commons guild. So it's a constituted organization which we can start to deliver peer-to-peer mentoring. So for these organizations, they can have a support network and a support infrastructure. And so that what we felt as an organization for 20 years of practicing was that we felt like within our disciplines, we didn't quite fit. We were never a right fit. And so we always felt, we had our peers, but I think that to have a really cohesive support infrastructure, it's really good. And then they're already happening where there are students who are being placed into our Commons organization created by the students, quarterly show and tell setups, and potentially future cultural commons teachers. Also, we have these partnerships which are flourishing, which are very exciting in terms of decentralized remote classrooms, so people don't, because these are also online courses. So, so if you are in Glasgow and don't want to move to London, we have we're discussing partnerships to do that with remote classrooms in commons organizations in those cities, public program and knowledge exchange with our partners, Design Museum and Tate Exchange, and potentially others, public and third sector training, and staff development and CPD. So there's quite a lot that can be accessed, you know, from free stuff to paid stuff, to make that all happen. And then also we have this, I can put this slide and the social media slide into the chat right now. So if you wanted to join, then please do so. And completely the final one, I promise you, it's not moving, it's decided, it's just the 15th of April. If you're interested in fashion, then the Common Mill is the project, is the project that Alice Holloway will be presenting.